Some stories don't just shock you, they challenge the category your brain wants to place them in. They sound like legend, yet they are pinned to real dates, real locations, real wreckage fields, and official names that can be traced. When people say a miracle happened, skeptics often hear poetry, while believers hear a description of reality. This episode lives in that tension, because the cases are real and documented, and still they land in the human mind as something larger than probability. Before we step into the record, subscribe to the channel and leave a like, because it helps this documentary series reach the people who actually want evidence-led storytelling. And it lets us keep building episodes where we follow what can be verified, without flattening the mystery that people feel when survival looks impossible. Our first case is attached to a number that became famous in its own right: 10.16 kilometers, or 33,333 feet. The height associated with the highest fall survived without a parachute as recorded by Guinness. The person connected to that record is Vesna Volovijo, a Yugoslav flight attendant who became the sole survivor of a Mitter disaster involving JAT Flight 367 on January 26, 1972, when the aircraft broke apart and came down near Srpska Krajina in what was then Czechoslovakia. Those are the anchor points you can check: the date, the flight, the location, and the fact of one survivor. What happened in the air is often summarized in a single sentence, but the details matter because they shape every later argument about how, in widely cited accounts, an explosion tore through the baggage compartment, the aircraft separated, and what followed was not one impact but a violent scattering of sections, metal, and people into winter terrain. Regardless of the broader political context people attach to it, the operational result is clear. The flight did not descend, it disintegrated. Here is the moment where the story becomes both explainable in pieces and still nearly unbearable as a whole. Vesna did not fall in the way most people picture it, as a single body tumbling cleanly through open air from cruise altitude to ground. The most durable explanations point to her being carried within a section of the aircraft, and that matters because structure can change the way energy is distributed at impact. A body alone meets the ground with a brutal simplicity, while contained space can deform, split, and absorb fractions of force in ways that, in extremely rare circumstances, keep the final deceleration from becoming instantly fatal. This does not make survival likely, it only makes it barely conceivable, and even then the odds remain so thin that many people reject the idea that physics alone can account for it. What followed after impact is one of the most chilling details in the record. She was found alive in the wreckage, and a local man, Bruno Hunk, is commonly credited with hearing her and providing first aid before rescue services arrived. That detail is not decorative. It's one of the reasons this case became fixed in public memory, because it moves the story from maybe into someone heard a living human voice where there should have been silence. The injuries and recovery are also part of why this case persists as miracle material. Accounts consistently describe severe trauma and a long rehabilitation, emphasizing that survival did not mean escape without consequence. That's an uncomfortable truth people often edit out when they repeat a miracle story, because the cultural impulse is to tell it as a clean victory, but real survivals are usually paid for in pain. Surgeries, months of relearning basic movement, and a life divided into before and after. If someone believes God intervened, this is often where they place the meaning, not in the absence of suffering, but in the fact that life continued at all. And then there is the shadow that follows almost every famous case: dispute. Years later, some journalists raised alternate theories about the altitude and circumstances, while the mainstream record still maintains the core account that made Vesna's story globally known. For the purposes of a documented case, the responsible conclusion is not to pretend controversy doesn't exist, but to recognize that even if arguments continue around the edges, the central fact remains intact. One woman survived a Mitter breakup event that killed everyone else aboard. If you stop here, The case already feels impossible. But this episode is not only about one fall, because the moment you accept that the sky has produced at least one documented survivor without a parachute, you have to ask whether there are other survivals that force the same question in a different way. And there is another case, just 1 year earlier, where a teenage girl fell from a plane after a lightning strike, still strapped to her seat. And the fall was only the beginning, because she then had to survive alone in the rainforest for 11 days. That second timeline changes the entire meaning of the word miracle, because it isn't one improbable instant. It is an extended refusal to die. 1 year earlier, on Christmas Eve of 1971, another aircraft entered weather that looked survivable until it wasn't. And in a matter of seconds, the ordinary rules of flight gave way to a kind of chaos that the mind resists describing because description makes it real. The plane was Lanza Flight 508, traveling across Peru, and among the passengers was a 17-year-old named Julianne Koepke, flying with her mother. The widely repeated, documented core of the event is stark. The aircraft was struck by lightning. It began to break apart in midair, and passengers were thrown from the cabin into open sky. In most disaster stories, the crash is the ending. For Julianne, the crash became the beginning of something far more difficult to explain, because she survived the fall, and then survived the world she landed in. The detail that shapes everything that follows is that she did not fall as a free body. She fell still strapped to her seat, and that single fact is the hinge between impossible and barely conceivable. A person falling alone accelerates into a stable, brutal speed that makes impact almost always fatal. But a seat section changes how air pushes back. It can tumble, it can catch wind in awkward angles, it can slow in short, uneven bursts as it rotates. And while none of that turns it into a parachute, it can shave off enough speed, in rare circumstances, to keep the body from being instantly destroyed. People who believe in divine intervention see the seat as a kind of providential cradle. People who search for mechanisms see it as an accidental device that altered the fall's profile. Both interpretations start from the same reality. She was still attached to that seat when she hit the rainforest. And the rainforest matters more than most people realize. It is not gentle, not forgiving, and not designed for human survival. But in the specific context of a fall, a dense canopy can behave like a layered braking system. Instead of one clean collision with hard ground, a falling object can tear through branches, leaves, and smaller limbs, each impact breaking something, each break absorbing energy, each deflection changing the angle of descent. It is violent and uncontrolled, but it can turn a single fatal stop into a series of brutal interruptions, spreading deceleration across more distance than a flat surface ever would. That is one of the few ways the physics can even begin to explain what happened. And even then, it doesn't make it likely, it only makes it possible. Julianne woke up alive with injuries that should have ended the story. She was hurt, disoriented, and alone, with the kind of silence that is never truly silent in a jungle, because every sound is movement, and every movement could be a threat. It is here that the word miracle begins to stretch, because surviving the impact is one improbable event, but staying alive afterward becomes an unfolding series of tests that don't stop simply because you already survived. The rainforest doesn't care that you fell from the sky. It asks new questions every hour. Can you keep moving? Can you keep your wounds from worsening? Can you find water that won't poison you? Can you endure the fear that grows when the landscape gives you no landmarks and no promise that anyone is coming? What separates this case from 1,000 other tragedies is that she made decisions that kept the timeline moving forward. Many retellings emphasize a crucial advantage. Her parents were scientists who worked in the Peruvian rainforest, and she had absorbed enough practical understanding to avoid some of the most fatal mistakes. She didn't treat the jungle as a place to conquer. She treated it as a system to read. One of the most repeated details is her strategy of following water. Because streams tend to lead to larger rivers, and rivers tend to lead to human activity. This is not a guarantee of survival. It's simply the difference between wandering in circles and giving yourself a direction that has meaning. Days passed, and the story becomes almost unbearable to imagine in real time, because the mind wants a rescue to arrive quickly. But reality doesn't respect the pacing of a film. Hunger, infection, exhaustion, and despair all become characters in the narrative, and the miracle, if you want to call it that, becomes endurance. Eventually, she reached signs of people, and then people themselves, and help arrived in the form of shelter, care, and a path out. When she was finally rescued, the case shifted again, because now it had witnesses beyond her memory and a documented survival period that turned a crash into a human saga. 11 days alone in the rainforest after falling from the sky. Place this beside the first case, and you see why these stories refuse to stay inside one explanation. Vesna Volavio is the miracle of a single impact that should have been fatal. Survival compressed into one moment of physics and chance. Julian Kopke is a miracle that unfolds across time. Survival stretched into a choices made under pain and fear. And now a larger question forms, the question that sits at the center of this episode. If there are mechanisms that make survival theoretically possible, why do these cases still feel like something beyond mechanism? And what happens to a person who becomes the living proof of an event that most people can only describe as divine? When you put these two cases side by side, the mind immediately tries to do what it always does with the unbearable. It searches for a rule. A rule would make the world feel stable again. A rule would let you say, "This is why it happened," and move on. But these stories resist being turned into a simple principle, because the very thing that makes them compelling is that they sit in the thin space between what is possible and what is overwhelmingly unlikely. This is where people start using different languages to describe the same reality. One person calls it physics, another calls it providence. Both are trying to explain why two human beings remained alive after events that normally erase everyone. To keep this documentary honest, the next step is to separate what can be reasonably described from what cannot be responsibly claimed. In Vesna Volavio's case, the elements that move the story from magic to mechanism are not glamorous, but they are consistent with how survival sometimes happen in extreme scenarios. She likely was not fully exposed to the airflow like a free-fall skydiver, and the structure around her mattered. Metal can crush, buckle, and absorb energy in ways that flesh cannot. If a person is inside a collapsing pocket of fuselage, the body's deceleration can be stretched by fractions of seconds, and in high-impact survival physics, those fractions are the difference between death and a narrow corridor of survival. Terrain matters too. A flat, hard surface delivers a clean, terminal stop. Uneven ground, snow, vegetation, and angled impacts can distribute force in chaotic ways that sometimes spare a life, even when they destroy everything else. None of this makes survival likely, and none of it makes it safe, but it is the kind of explanation that allows the event to exist inside a world governed by rules. In Julian Kopke's case, the mechanism looks different, but the logic is similar. She was strapped to a seat section, which can change airflow and reduce the clean efficiency of a fatal fall, and she hit a rainforest canopy, which can behave like a layered braking system. Again, this doesn't mean the rainforest is soft. It means the canopy can force a descending object to break through multiple layers, each layer taking a piece of energy, each collision changing the trajectory, each break extending the distance over which the body slows down. When you look at the pieces, you can build a plausible physical narrative for how she could have survived the impact. The problem is that plausible is not the same as satisfying, because the mechanisms are only half the story, and they do not answer the question that makes people whisper the word miracle. Mechanisms explain how survival could happen, but they do not explain why it happened to these particular people in these particular configurations. In a plane that breaks apart, many people might be contained within sections, Many people might hit terrain that is less immediately fatal than concrete. Many people might be close to a path that leads to rescue, and still almost all of them die. The difference is not just physics. It is the specific alignment of countless variables that have no reason to align. This is where probability becomes the true subject of the episode. Not because the audience wants math on a screen, but because probability is how modern minds try to talk about miracles without using the word God. When believers say, "It wasn't their time," they are expressing the sense that the alignment of events feels purposeful. When skeptics say, "It was a 1 in a million chain of chance," they are expressing the same sense without attributing intention. Both positions quietly agree on one thing: the outcome is extraordinarily rare. The debate is not about rarity. It is about meaning, and meaning is not a small thing. It shapes what survivors do with their lives and what societies do with their stories. A person who survives an impossible fall becomes a mirror that reflects the viewer's worldview back at them. If you are a person of faith, you see protection. If you are a person shaped by science, you see the edge cases where the universe behaves like a system and not like a story. If you are a person who has been close to death, you see the terrifying truth that survival can be random. These cases become cultural objects, not just historical events, and that is why they attract myth. Once myth starts growing, it changes the atmosphere around the facts. People start exaggerating details, compressing timelines, smoothing contradictions, turning messy reality into a clean arc where the miracle has no shadows. That is why it matters that parts of Vesna's case have been debated in later years. Even if the central reality stands, controversy becomes a magnet for attention, and attention tends to pull narratives toward extremes. The responsible approach is to hold the core timeline steady and admit that famous cases often accumulate competing claims. This is not weakness. It is what makes the documentary stance credible. A real case can be extraordinary and still be surrounded by uncertainty on the edges. The same is true for Julianne's case in a different way. The miracle isn't only that she fell and lived. It's that she lasted long enough to be found. If she had died on day 3 or day 4, the crash would be remembered as a tragedy and her story would be a footnote. Because she lived for 11 days, the story becomes a testimony. But the difference between dying on day 3 and surviving to day 11 is often not one heroic choice. It is a chain of small decisions and small mercies. It is finding water instead of missing it. It is not getting an infection that turns fatal. It is not breaking a leg on the wrong step. It is not being bitten at the wrong time. It is, in other words, a timeline held together by thin threads. People call thin threads God when they feel too meaningful to name as chance. At this point in the episode, we can state the framework clearly. The records can support the existence of these survivals and the broad circumstances around them. They can also support certain physical explanations that make the outcomes theoretically possible. But the records cannot give you the final answer that people want. The answer that tells you whether something intentional reached into the timeline and moved a piece at the perfect moment. That question lives outside documentation because it is not a question of what happened. It is a question of why it happened, and why is where belief begins. So the real documentary question becomes sharper. What do these cases reveal about the human need to find meaning in survival? And what do they reveal about the cost of being called a miracle? Because as soon as a person becomes the one who lived, their life is no longer only theirs. Their survival becomes a symbol, and symbols are heavy. In the next part, we will step into that weight. We'll look at what happens after the headlines fade, how survivors carry the story, how public fascination reshapes memory, and why the line between miracle and mechanism is not only an argument about science or faith, but also an argument about how we cope with the randomness of death. There is a moment in every disaster story when the public mind turns away. The wreckage is cleared, the headlines thin out, and people who watched from a safe distance return to their routines with the uneasy comfort of having consumed tragedy as information. But for survivors of the impossible, the story does not end where attention ends. In many ways, that is where the real story begins, because survival is not only an event, it is a lifelong condition. And when the survival becomes famous, it turns into a role the person is forced to inhabit, often without ever choosing it. In Vesna Volovier's case, the world remembers a number and a phrase, fell from the sky. But the lived reality is a body carrying consequences, and a mind expected to convert trauma into meaning for strangers. Being labeled the miracle can feel like a blessing from the outside, and like pressure from the inside. People ask for the story again and again, as if repetition makes it easier, as if telling it is proof of strength, as if the survivor owes the world a clean narrative that fits inside a headline. What that demand often ignores is that severe trauma can fracture memory and blur details, and that public retellings can begin to shape what the survivor is expected to remember. A person becomes suspended between what they experienced, what they were told, what was written, and what the world needs the story to be. Julianne Cope's story carries a different kind of weight because her survival was not only impact but endurance. She becomes the girl who walked out of the rainforest, and that framing pulls the public narrative toward heroism. People love endurance stories because they suggest that willpower can defeat death. But the truth is more fragile than that. Endurance is not only strength. It is also timing, knowledge, luck, and a chain of small decisions that could have broken at any point. Turning her 11 days into a simple myth of toughness risks erasing the real fear, the pain, and the constant possibility of dying anyway. It also creates an unfair shadow over everyone who didn't survive, as if death is a moral failure rather than the most common outcome in extreme conditions. And yet, we cannot ignore why these stories spread, why they stay alive across decades, languages, and cultures. Even when people consume them as entertainment, they offer something deeper: permission to hope. Someone facing illness hears she lived when she shouldn't have, and feels the grip of despair loosen slightly. Someone grieving hears the same sentence and feels that life still contains surprises that aren't only cruel. That hope may not be rational in a purely statistical sense, but it is human, and it is one of the reasons miracle remains such a powerful word. This is where the channel's theme becomes clear. A miracle, in the way most people use the word, is not a laboratory conclusion. It is a name we give to the space between what is possible and what is probable, between mechanism and meaning. When a believer says, "God saved her," they are often saying, "I need to believe the world is not indifferent." When a skeptic says, "It was physics and chance," they are often saying, "I need to believe the world is knowable." Both reactions begin with the same shock. The outcome should not exist, and yet it does. The argument is not really about the facts. The argument is about what the facts are allowed to mean. So what can we responsibly say if we take documentation seriously and still respect belief? We can say that these survivals happened, that there are plausible physical factors that may explain parts of how they happened, and that none of those factors make the outcomes anything less than extraordinary. We can say that the mechanisms, even when plausible, do not reduce the emotional and cultural force of improbability, because improbability is exactly what drives people toward interpretation. And we can say something else that often gets lost, that survival is not always a clean gift. It can be a complicated inheritance filled with pain, guilt, questions, and the heavy loneliness of being the one. If you want to hold the story in the most honest way, the best framework is simple. The first layer is what is documented: the flight, the breakup, the survivor, the location, the rescue, the injuries, the timeline. The second layer is what is plausible: how structure, terrain, canopy, airflow, and circumstance might make survival physically possible in rare conditions. The third layer is belief: what you think that rarity means, and whether you see intention in the alignment of events. A documentary can responsibly speak with confidence about the first layer, cautiously about the second, and respectfully about the third, without pretending that belief is either proven or ridiculous. That balance is the difference between investigation and propaganda. And maybe that is the real reason these cases still matter. Because whether you call it God, fate, luck, or a statistical outlier, you are still forced to confront the same truth. Life sometimes continues where it should have ended, and when it does, it reveals something about us. It reveals how much we want meaning. It reveals how fragile we feel when faced with randomness. And it reveals, in the clearest possible way, that survival is not only about physics, it is also about the stories we tell ourselves to understand why we're still here. If this episode gave you value and you want more real, evidence-led stories that sit on the line between miracle and mystery, subscribe to the channel and leave a like, because it helps this series reach the right audience. And before you go, comment below with your honest take when you hear these timelines. Do you see divine intervention? Or do you see rare physics and chance? And why do you believe that's the best explanation?